Yo guys, what is going on? JPS back with another video, and today we're going to be learning about Margaret Thatcher, the greatest or worst prime minister, depending on who you are. And this reaction was directly influenced by my viewing of Brassed Off, which was a film we watched over on Patreon. Absolutely loved that film, but it left a lot of questions in my head about Thatcher and her legacy and what was really happening at the time, because obviously the movie is centralized around pit closures, which isn't the only film we've watched that's centralized around pit closures and had those involved in it, which is background for me to be interested in this. But I think that really catalyzed me watching this specific documentary on Margaret Thatcher or history, whatever this is. I read through the comments on this, by the way, and a lot of people are saying it's really good, that it's unbiased and presents history as it happened. So you guys will be the final witness or final judge of that, but I'm hoping that this is a good piece to react to about Thatcher. But yeah, that movie is really what influenced me to do this. So if you guys want to watch my reaction to that movie and tons of other films and shows, join Patreon. It's the first link in description. But yeah, we're going to be reacting to this. I'm super excited for it. Seems like Thatcher, there were people who celebrated her death. There were people who thought she was literally the best person who ever led the country. So it's like, what's going on here? It's a lot to break down. So let's get right into this. Hit the like button, hit subscribe, and let's go.
This video is made possible by NordVPN. Take control of your internet experience today. Go to nordvpn.com/biographics and use our coupon code BIOGRAPH. She's one of the longest-serving prime ministers in British history. As head of the Conservative Party, Margaret Thatcher led the UK from May 1979 right the way through to November of 1990. In that time, she ushered in an era of reform unparalleled in the 20th century. Under her watch, the post-war settlement was torn up, state assets were privatised, the financial market let rip, and the cultural fabric of Britain changed beyond recognition. But the transformations didn't just stop at home. Alongside her US counterpart Ronald Reagan, Thatcher helped spread the gospel of economic liberty and individual freedom across the entire planet. When she finally left office, she was widely recognised as the most significant British leader since Churchill. Yet while Churchill is still widely loved in the UK, Margaret Thatcher's legacy is hugely divisive. Taking over an ailing Britain, her economic shock therapy devastated entire regions, even as it saved the country as a whole. Both worshipped and reviled at home. This is the story of Britain's most controversial leader. When Margaret Hilda Roberts was born on October 13th, 1925, there was nothing that suggested she would one day lead her nation. Her father was a grocer, and young Margaret grew up in achingly modest circumstances. The family had no indoor toilet, and warm water was an unknown luxury. Yet it wasn't a petit bourgeois lifestyle alone that made Margaret an unlikely candidate for future PM. It was the fact that she was a she. Right up until Thatcher became Education Secretary in 1969, there had only ever been 4 female cabinet ministers in UK history and not a single prime minister. As Thatcher herself would say in a TV interview in 1973, the idea of a woman ever rising beyond the cabinet to become prime minister seemed impossible. Still, despite living in a society that considered casual sexism a legitimate hobby, Margaret never really felt she needed to pursue ladylike interests. Her major passion was chemistry, which she studied at Oxford under the Nobel Prize winner Dorothy Hodgkin. But even as she was winning plaudits for her science work, Thatcher was discovering her other lifelong love: politics. In 1945, the UK's first post-war election resulted in a shock win not for Winston Churchill's Conservatives, but for the left-wing Labour Party of Clement Attlee. The Labour landslide completely upended Britain. In his 6 years in power, Attlee created the NHS, the welfare state, and what became known as the post-war settlements, an unspoken agreement between the parties that the state needed to interfere in the economy. Naturally, Thatcher hated this. 1 year after Attlee took power, she became president of the Oxford University Conservative Association, from where she railed against the Labour tide transforming Britain. So good was she at this that it soon convinced her to enter politics proper. At the 1950 election, Thatcher stood as a Conservative candidate for the seat of Dartford. While some in her party were appalled at the idea of a lady human running, she still managed to increase her share of the local vote by 50%, an early sign of her electoral prowess. But it wasn't enough to win, nor did she net enough votes in the 1951 election, despite this being the election that saw Churchill and the Conservatives return to power. Yet, all was not lost. It was through her campaigning in Dartford that Margaret met Dennis Thatcher. A rich, somewhat dopey guy, Dennis would turn out to be the ideal husband. He was tremendously supportive of Margaret's ambitions for public office, and so hands-off it was like he was permanently wearing a straitjacket. Although this did have some odd side effects, such as when Dennis went to the cricket rather than interfere in the birth of their children, he was the solid, supportive rock that Margaret needed, especially now that her interest in politics was becoming an obsession. In 1959, after a few years practicing as a barrister, Thatcher stood again for election, this time in the Conservative safe seat of Finchley. Unsurprisingly, she won. More surprisingly, she soon began to skyrocket up through the party's ranks. By 1961, she'd been appointed Secretary in the Ministry of Pensions and National Insurance. Although her party lost power in 1964, its new leader, Ted Heath, invited her into the shadow cabinet. Sadly, not the Tory version of the Council of Doom, but what us Brits call the out-of-power party's highest-ranking members. That meant that when Heath unexpectedly won the 1970 election, Margaret Thatcher became only the fifth female cabinet minister in British history. Despite working for a party full of men who'd never quite mentally removed the "No Girls Allowed" sign from their tree houses, Thatcher had ascended to one of the top positions in the land. Little could anyone have known that this was only the start.
Oh yeah, the Iron Lady. This is
Anyone
really
living in
good so
Britain,
far.
The 1970s were like being on the world's worst roller coaster. It was a decade when Britain teetered on the verge of bankruptcy, when powerful unions called strikes that paralysed the country. But for Margaret Thatcher, it was also the decade when everyone associated her primarily with milk. In 1971, looking to make savings in the education budget, Thatcher eliminated a post-war policy of free school milk for children. Although it was justifiable, the optics were so bad that it became a PR disaster. For the rest of her tenure, Thatcher was followed everywhere by cries of "Thatcher, milk snatcher." But unpleasant as this was, it was nothing compared to what was going on behind the scenes. Thatcher and Ted Heath hated one another. While it was partly personal, it was also Thatcher being sick of defending her government's dreadful record. It was under Heath that the 3-day week came in, when businesses were only allowed electricity 3 days a week to conserve energy. As a result, the Conservatives lost both 1974 elections. Suddenly, Thatcher was out of government, but now the grocer's daughter from Lincolnshire knew what she had to do. She had to get rid of Heath. These days, losing an election means stepping down as leader of your party, but back then, you could keep right on trucking so long as no one challenged you to a leadership contest. The Conservatives being the party of loyalty, no one wanted to challenge Heath. Except for Thatcher. The newspapers thought she was out of her mind. When Thatcher stood for leader of the Tories, it was assumed that Heath would romp home to victory. But Thatcher went on the attack. Gathering the party's right wing around her, she lambasted Heath's dreadful record. In February 1975, the shock results of the first ballot came in. Thatcher had won. Now, under the Conservative Party's weird rules, this didn't actually make her the leader, but Heath could see his position was untenable, and he stepped aside. And just like that, Thatcher became the first female leader of a major UK party. Not that anyone expected her to rise any further. In 1975, the Labour government was headed by the affable, broadly popular Harold Wilson. So what if Thatcher was making barnstorming anti-communist speeches that earned her the nickname the Iron Lady? So what if the Tories were getting better at messaging? With Wilson leading the Labour Party, she was probably doomed. Unfortunately for Labour, Wilson wouldn't be around much longer. In 1976, Harold Wilson abruptly resigned as Prime Minister, a move now thought to have been brought on by the discovery that he had early-stage Alzheimer's. His replacement was a charisma void known as James Callaghan, a guy so inept that he turned a mildly pro-Labour country into rabid Tories. Under Callaghan, Britain collapsed into economic turmoil. There were gigantic pay freezes, nationwide battles with overpowered unions. In late 1978, things culminated in the winter of discontent.
It really sounded like the 70s were not the time to be alive. Like, only allowing businesses 3 days of electricity a week? Am I missing something, or I just had no idea that it was that bad? I mean, post-war is not easy, but wow. Makes sense, I guess.
A period when uncollected refuse piled high in the streets and bodies were left unburied. It was likely the country's post-war low point. The UK was an ungovernable mess. It was also exactly what Thatcher needed. On March the 28th, Margaret Thatcher called a no-confidence vote in Callaghan's government, triggering an early election. As the campaign heated up, the Conservatives played a blinder, plastering London with posters of long dole queues under the caption, "Labour isn't working." Callaghan, meanwhile, gave the impression of someone who expected to win because, well, duh, his opponent was a girl. On May the 3rd, 1979, the Conservatives won the election by a decent margin. It wasn't a landslide, but it was definitely enough to comfortably form a government. On that date, Margaret Thatcher became not only the UK's first female Prime Minister, but the first female leader of any major Western democracy. As she entered 10 Downing Street, the triumphant Thatcher declared,
"Where there is discord, may we bring harmony."
As you're about to see, this wouldn't exactly happen. Now, before we get on with the trials and tribulations of Ms. Thatcher, here's a quick word from our sponsor.
I don't know if it's possible to bring a harmony to where there's discord. It's not possible in the United States. And speaking of the United States, we have yet to elect a lady president yet. So who knows when that'll happen. You guys are a step ahead of us.
Of 1980 that the lady's not for turning. Thatcher's closest advisors were secretly urging her to make a gigantic U-turn lest the Tories be stomped at the 1983 election. And it was onto this sinking ship that Argentina suddenly threw a gigantic lifesaver. And okay, let's just have a quick geography lesson now. Down in the South Atlantic, about 483 kilometers off the Argentine coast, lies the Falkland Islands. Despite being nearly 13,000 kilometers from London, they've been a British territory since at least 1833. By 1982, though, the Falklands were only home to a declining population of 1,800 people. Although Britain still claimed the territory, it refused to invest there, and the private hope of successive governments had been that the islanders would voluntarily accept Argentinian sovereignty at some point in the future. But the military junta in Buenos Aires was tired of waiting. On April 2nd, 1982, they occupied the Falklands. A few days later, they also took the British territory of South Georgia. The junta assumed London was too broke, too unwilling to send soldiers to die for the sake of a godforsaken rock on the other side of the world.
They were nearly right.
When news broke, the cabinet's feeling was that the Falklands would have to be surrendered. But the junta hadn't counted on Thatcher. Egged on by the Navy, Thatcher declared war on Argentina. A Royal Navy flotilla was sent to retake the islands. With that, the Falklands War began. Today, it's almost impossible to overstate the effect the short war had on Thatcher's popularity. Remember how George W. Bush's approval rating hit 92% after 9/11? Well, something similar happened here. Thatcher's resolute defense of British territory struck a chord with ordinary citizens. It helped that the war was short, lasting a mere 74 days before Argentina surrendered, and that it was very one-sided. 649 Argentine troops were killed versus 255 British troops. But make no mistake, the iron will Thatcher displayed in the face of foreign aggression made her a hero. It elevated her profile on the international stage. Already allied with US President Ronald Reagan, she now started to look like his equal. Come the 1983 election,
yeah. We learned about the Falklands War, but that is still, just thinking about it, that is a hell of a move to make, and it's no wonder that her and Reagan got along. Let's just keep going into this. I have a lot of different thoughts about mine.
This crushed Labour in a landslide. With a powerful new mandate, the gloves were at last off. Over the next 2 terms, Margaret Thatcher was going to change Britain beyond all recognition. Thatcher's second term began with a powerful message, appointing Ian McGregor head of the National Coal Board. Back in 1979, Thatcher had hired McGregor to make the state-owned British Steel profitable again. McGregor had achieved this at the loss of 95,000 jobs and at the economic devastation of entire towns. Now Thatcher was asking him to do the same thing for the ailing coal industry. But while British Steel had folded to McGregor's iron will, coal was going to be much tougher. The National Union of Miners was Britain's most powerful union at a time when unions could break an entire premiership. It was the NUM in 1973 that had exacerbated the 3-day week, leading to Ted Heath's downfall. Now they were looking to do the same to Thatcher. Unfortunately for the NUM, Thatcher had brought to this figurative knife fight not just a gun, but a goddamn bazooka. On March 6, 1984, a local strike at Cortonwood Colliery was used by NUM President Arthur Scargill to force a general strike across the nation. But Thatcher was prepared. Coal had been secretly stockpiled, non-unionized firms were hired to do strike breaking, police forces were primed to fight. The battle was on. And it really was a battle, or rather a series of battles. The worst took place at Orgreave, when a mounted police charge into a crowd of strikers led to 123 serious injuries. But the main weapon Thatcher deployed wasn't truncheons, but time. As the strike dragged on, laws were passed that stopped the families of striking miners from receiving welfare. In effect, Thatcher starved her enemies into submission. And submit they did. On March 3, 1985, the strike was called off. The miners returned to work. Broken. Over the next decade, McGregor and his successors closed all but 15 of Britain's 174 deep pits. The economic engine of entire regions was wiped out, leaving jobless wastelands. With NUM defeated, the days of big unions bringing Britain to a standstill were over. But although Thatcher won this war just as she had the Falklands, the other great war of her premiership would prove to be unwinnable. The Troubles were an undeclared civil war in Northern Ireland that pitted majority Protestant Unionists who wanted to stay in the UK against majority Catholic Republicans who wanted to join Ireland proper. When Thatcher took power, the Troubles had already been running for a decade, but they were about to get much worse. Things really kicked off on August 27, 1979, when the IRA first assassinated a member of the royal family, Lord Mountbatten, before killing 18 British soldiers in a double bomb attack. But Thatcher's biggest test came in March of 1981. That month, IRA prisoners, including Member of Parliament Bobby Sands, began a hunger strike to force the British state to treat them as prisoners of war. The thought horrified Thatcher, who declared the men were common criminals, saying, "Crime is crime is crime, it is not political." By the time October rolled around, 10 of the hunger strikers were dead, and their mistreatment had turned them into international celebrities. It had also turned Thatcher into a Republican hate figure. On the 12th of October 1984, an IRA bomb at the Conservative conference in Brighton killed 5 people. Thatcher escaped unharmed and made a speech the following day, vowing to fight on. She hoped to inflict a decisive victory on the forces of republicanism. Instead, the Troubles went supernova. Over the next few years, the IRA bombed civilians, killed policemen with mortars, and even assassinated Thatcher's friend, the Conservative MP Ian Gow. It wouldn't be until Thatcher left office that the Troubles would come to an end, thanks to the work of her successors, John Major and Tony Blair. Although it was far from a defining theme of her premiership, Thatcher's failed attempt to defeat the IRA showed the limits of the Iron Lady's power. Sometimes, just sometimes, perhaps the lady should have been for turning.
For turning. Seems like
Away
she got
from
an
the
idea
wars
and went
and
for it.
anti-union crusades, Maggie was also overseeing a social revolution. Thatcherism preached hard work, personal responsibility, and economic liberalism. It promised a world in which anyone could become well off, provided they were happy to roll up their sleeves. While this may have seemed a joke to those in depressed former mining towns, it was true for enough people to keep her in power. One of the most popular policies was right to buy, which allowed those in council housing to save up and buy the place for themselves. But the biggest rewards fell to those who profited from the Big Bang. As early as 1979, Thatcher had begun loosening regulations in London's financial sector, leading to a lot of people becoming very rich. But it was on October the 27th, 1986, that things really took off. That was the day the city was almost completely deregulated, allowing things like foreign firms to own UK brokers and abolishing the fixed commission on trades. Overnight, the Big Bang made 1,500 millionaires. It created iconic districts like London's Canary Wharf. Skyscrapers began to sprout up. Money poured in. It was the transformation of the financial sector from the bowler hat-wearing old boys club of yesteryear into the turbo-capitalist free-for-all of today. Yet Thatcher's revolution went beyond the mere confines of Britain. Under her watch, the UK became a global player in a way it simply hadn't been since Churchill left office. In 1984, for example, Thatcher began courting Mikhail Gorbachev even before he became Soviet leader. During a visit to Britain, Gorbachev famously had a 6-hour argument with Thatcher over the benefits and ills of communism. When they were done, Thatcher declared, we can do business together, and set about becoming both Gorbachev's best friend and worst enemy in the West, urging a skeptical Ronald Reagan to work with the new Soviet premier. Not that she'd let Russia push her around, though. Invited to the Soviet Union in 1987, Thatcher went on live TV and spent an hour talking about all the USSR's failings. For citizens in communist nations, that speech was like seeing someone articulate everything they'd been feeling for decades. Thatcher became an overnight celebrity in the Eastern Bloc. Even today, countries like the Czech Republic consider her a British hero, on par with Churchill. But there were missteps too. In the latter part of the 1980s, Thatcher vehemently opposed sanctions against South Africa's apartheid regime. She considered Nelson Mandela a typical terrorist and proudly boasted that Britain was the only Commonwealth nation still trading with the white supremacist state. Ouch. Yet, there were also surprise moments when she broke her own party's line. In the late 1980s, she became one of the first world leaders to sound the alarm on climate change, helping push for a World Environment Fund, the preservation of rainforests, and the introduction of emissions targets. Overall, then, there was enough popular stuff in the Thatcher programme to ensure that she cruised to an easy victory in 1987, becoming the UK's only 20th century leader to serve 3 terms. And still, she seemed destined to go on. There was even talk of her winning a possible 4th term. But it was not to be. The woman who had overhauled Britain had already sown the seeds of her own destruction. When the end finally came, it was going to be with a swiftness that shocked everybody. In the end, what brought Thatcher down was what has brought down every single Conservative Prime Minister since: Europe. On January 1st, 1973, Ted Heath had taken Britain into what was then the European Economic Community, a move confirmed by a 1975 referendum. Come the 1980s, the Conservatives were still mostly a pro-Europe party, at least in theory. Unlike her MPs, Thatcher was rabidly anti-Europe. At first, this was something her MPs managed as best they could. It even occasionally brought benefits when Thatcher reduced Britain's budget contributions in 1984, but it soon became a major liability. As the continent integrated further, Thatcher became a vocal Eurosceptic, rallying against the continent's leaders. This would be fine if she'd managed to get her party on side, but official policy remained pro-Europe. In effect, Thatcher was sabotaging her own government. The result was a string of senior ministers resigning, all contributing to a perception that the Tories were becoming dangerously incompetent. Then, just as this gigantic pile of fertilizer was starting to look extremely combustible, Thatcher threw an unrelated match onto it. The poll tax is why Scotland is, to this day, passionately anti-Tory. A political move designed to deprive Labour councils of revenue, it abolished local tax rates, instead levying a flat tax on every adult. The upshot was that the rich saw their bills plummet, while the middle classes, the very backbone of the Thatcherite revolution, saw their costs go shooting up. In 1989, Thatcher piloted it in Scotland ahead of a rollout across England and Wales. It was a disaster. There were protests, mass acts of civil disobedience. By 1990, over 1 million had refused to pay. Ministers begged Thatcher not to push ahead with the hated tax. But, like a latter-day George III, Thatcher insisted on it. On March 31st, 1990, central London was devastated by an anti-poll tax riot. That summer, discontent brewed across the nation. Sadly, by now, Maggie had become a caricature of herself. She was the Iron Lady not for turning, even when turning would have saved her political career. Things finally came to a head in October. Following a European summit on integration, Thatcher gave an angry speech in which she replied to the idea with a shouted, "No! No! No!" In response, the pro-Europe cabinet member Geoffrey Howe resigned. For such a measured man, his resignation speech was devastating, concluding that the party needed to question its loyalty to Thatcher. At another time, Thatcher could have shrugged it off. But in 1990, with poll tax riots burning across the country and a pro-European party fed up with their Euroscepticism, she was toast. On November 15th, the Europhile conservative Michael Hestenstein did what Thatcher had herself done to Heath all those years ago. He challenged her to a leadership contest, and when the results came in, Thatcher was doomed. Although she got the most votes, it had been by a pitiable margin. As the two headed into the second round, Thatcher realised, to her profound shock, that she might lose. So she jumped before she was pushed. At 7:30 a.m. on November 22nd, 1990, Margaret Thatcher resigned as Prime Minister. At the moment she stepped down, she was the longest continuously serving Prime Minister since 1827. She was also one of the 2 most influential post-war PMs, setting an economic agenda that has pretty much lasted intact until today. Only Clement Attlee really comes close in terms of significance, and it was his long-lasting post-war settlement that Thatcher ripped up. Yet, despite her continued significance, despite her achievement opening the door to future female leaders, Thatcher spent her years out of office bitter and unhappy. She fumed over her betrayal by her party, fumed over the creation of the EU. With nowhere left to channel her prodigious energies, she turned inwards. By 2000, she was showing signs of the dementia that would soon consume her, just as Alzheimer's had consumed Harold Wilson before her. By the end, the dementia rendered her mute, almost incapable of doing even the simplest action. It said she liked to spend her days staring at a painting of a Victorian hunting party, not really doing anything, just watching the crowd of painted dogs for signs of life. Margaret Thatcher passed away on April the 8th, 2013. While the world mourned the death of a great leader, the reaction in Britain itself, where towns devastated by her economic policies still haven't recovered, was more mixed. That week, the number 2 record in the British chart was Ding Dong, the Witch is Dead. Yet, for all the bile many heaped upon her, for all the hatred she stirred up, Thatcher's legacy is all around us. It's from her Euroscepticism that the forces grew that would unleash Brexit, from her wave of deregulation that today's City of London was created. Almost every facet of modern life that we Brits take for granted, the depressed post-industrial towns, the special relationship with America, the lack of paralysing French-style strikes, all have their roots in Thatcherism. In the end, then, the good and the bad of her legacy are impossible to separate. She was who she was, with the blind faith to do both necessary things for Britain's future and to commit screw-ups that still haunt the nation to this day. In a world without Maggie Thatcher, many would be worse off, some would be better off, but all would be able to agree on one thing. They were living in a completely different world from us, one in which Britain, Europe, and the former nations of the Soviet Union had very different fates. If greatness is measured purely in terms of impact, then that surely makes her one of the greatest prime ministers of all. So I really hope you did find...
I want you guys to let me know what you think about this video right now in the comments. That was insane. I don't even have much background knowledge on Margaret Thatcher, but I can already tell you right now that was a great unbiased view of her. I felt like anytime anything good or bad was said, it was immediately followed with something of the opposite to really nail it home that this was an unbiased story of Margaret Thatcher. And I honestly don't know what to say about Thatcher. I feel like it'd be wrong for me to say, oh, I think she was a good prime minister, a bad prime minister, even if I thought that was the case. What I do think is that if Margaret Thatcher were around today, I just think she'd be a force for something. I don't, it seems like a lot of these different things, like especially in the United States, if Margaret Thatcher came over to the United States, I think something would happen there. I think something would happen. Yeah, despite all these different things that Thatcher did, it's very hard to just to be like, oh yeah, really change this or revolutionize the way we did this and for the better or whatever. Because I know there's a lot of good things. Good is very subjective that Thatcher did, but after watching those films and the way like the pit closures were portrayed and things like that, like there's ways to go about progress without just wiping out entire towns. And like those are actual people too, where you're. I don't know. To me, I don't think it was as simple as just closing them and going about business. Like, but again, that's a very biased view because I've only seen, the British films where the pit closures and like the way they talk about Thatcher as if she's a demon, and people literally celebrated her death. I mean, you heard that "Ding Dong, the Witch is Dead" was one of the top songs played when she died, but. I don't know. I really don't know what to think about Thatcher, and I think that's the entire point. Is like it's such a mixed character, and even for being a politician, because every politician is hated by people. That's what I think. What makes Thatcher so special when comparing her to other politicians is like she was so true to her policies, and that's the whole point. Not going back or really standing. Like she really stood for what she believed in and thought was best. Which is what leads to a lot of people seeing her through this unfiltered lens. Like other politicians, you'll be like, oh yeah, I mean, half the people hate them, half the people don't like them. Like it's a politician. What the hell did you expect? Thatcher is really viewed as like an actual, like a tangible person in office, rather than just a talking head politician that you're completely used to and that you're not really going to pay too much attention to because it's a damn politician. But Thatcher, I feel like, was so real and authentic that led to people being able to truly hate her or truly love her, or truly be like, what the hell's happening here, and kind of in the middle like I am. But the whole point is it's truly, like, I think that's the gist I'm getting from Thatcher's legacy. You guys can let me know if that's a good or bad take. I don't really care. This is, again, based off of such a small amount of background knowledge, and this is a good video, though. I thought this was a really good video. I want to hear what your thoughts are in the comments. What do you think of Thatcher? Let me know. You thought, especially for those who lived under Thatcher's reign, what was it like? I mean, another thing that I don't think was emphasized enough is what Thatcher was handed coming into office. I mean, he talked about the 70s, from what they sound like, wasn't the best time to be alive. So it's not very easy to just get handed that. But there's an argument to be made about that for every politician who comes in, like, oh, it's such a mess right now, and but that's how progress is made, because you can't just be happy and be like, oh, we're content, we're fine, so they just need to keep things going. No, nothing's ever going to change that way. It always has to be, oh, things are in flames right now. How are they gonna do it? There has to be something to come back from like that. But yeah, I thought it was an excellent video, and I'm really glad I got to check this out and get some more information on Margaret Thatcher and her legacy. I love how the pit closures were mentioned. I wish they were talking about it a bit more, but maybe that's just their emphasis wasn't on that. But yeah, let me know what you guys thought of everything. I asked you a bunch of questions, so feel free to answer them in the comments down below. But with that being said, I'll catch you all in the next one. Peace.